I don't know all of the reasons. I did not know this person. I was just offering to help out in this situation. But I was struck as I just explored literally her life through her belongings, how this woman who had lived this global life at the end had been reduced to such a small space. And I think one of the things that I was struck was the reality that when we have unprocessed trauma, when we are struggling with addictions, it does make our lives smaller. And the lie that most addicts tell themselves is this addiction is giving me a bigger life, a more expansive life. But the consequences, the reality is that it just got smaller and smaller and smaller over time.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be back with you today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm always good. That's not true. I'm good.
You're usually good.
I'm usually good.
Well, talking about usually good, we brought in our favorite guest, Debbie Laaser, Director of Faithful and True, is back with us today, and I'm Randy Evert, your co-host. We'd like to start today's podcast with really a great topic that Greg came up with from a real-life experience.
So today's podcast is a little bit different because I do want to just talk about a personal experience that I had recently that was really formative and challenging and clarifying, I think. So to set it up, I recently had the opportunity to help someone who had recently passed away clean out their house. There was a connection, and so we were invited to help. And so some of us went over there to do that. And I was struck by the amount of chaos that was in this particular house. It was an older person who had passed away, and it was like everywhere you looked, there was stuff. There was just clutter, and we're all kind of familiar with the imagery of hoarding, and in this particular case, I think that absolutely fits. And I remember just stepping into the house and just how restrictive it felt, how almost claustrophobic I got when there was, I'm going to keep using that term, there was stuff just everywhere. And so today in the podcast, I just want to talk a little bit, and you and Deb, and we can talk about just the reality of the consequences of unprocessed trauma and addiction. And so to set the stage, I want to share a little bit about what I know about this person. I am going to use the pronoun she because it was a woman, and that's easier to use that context. So one of the things I know about this woman, that at one point in her life, she was a world traveler, literally. She was a single woman, she had resources, and this was kind of in the years where you would go on tours with groups. Her house was filled with maps of places she had been, and she kept everything from those trips. There were photographs, any brochures, any literature, she had those things. And so the reality was there was a time in her life where she was a world traveler. And yet, as you look at where she ended up, it was this visualization of her world just got smaller and smaller as she got older. As she collected things, as her possessions overtook her home. I think eventually when she died, her world had been reduced to the chair that she sat in. She could no longer even get to her bedroom or her bed. There was a pathway that would take her to the restroom, and there was a pathway that would take her to her kitchen. But beyond that, there was not space for her to live. And I don't know all of the reasons. I did not know this person. I was just offering to help out in this situation. But I was struck as I just explored literally her life through her belongings, how this woman who had lived this global life at the end had been reduced to such a small space. And I think one of the things that I was struck was the reality that when we have unprocessed trauma, when we are struggling with addictions, it does make our lives smaller. And the lie that most addicts tell themselves is this addiction is giving me a bigger life, a a more expansive life. But the consequences, the reality is that it just got smaller and smaller and smaller over time.
You know, it's interesting, Greg, as you talk about the fact that addictions, continue to make our lives smaller and smaller. Even in the beginning, we make the meaning of an addiction as being about something that was painful, and that there's history to that. And there might be people out there who are listening that would say, well, what's the matter with that woman? What is her problem? And they might start judging her for what she is collecting or the amount of space she has left for herself. But we're learning to ask what happened to her, which is a totally different question. That somewhere in her life, something happened for her to begin using possessions and things to medicate perhaps certain emotions that she was having, or needs that she had that she was getting met in an illegitimate way, as we would say.
Yeah. One of the things that was evident was, and I want to say this, in this conversation, it is not about criticizing this woman or judging her for her life. In fact, one of the principles of recovery is don't compare, identify. And there was so much about her life I could identify with. I know what it is to feel out of control. I know what it is to be consumed by something. One of the things that seemed evident is that she also had a spending addiction, that we discovered just boxes and boxes of unopened things where I think earlier on, we're so familiar with Amazon now, but earlier in her life when it was discovered that you could order things online, through the TV or online, we would just see these unopened packages of things, trinkets, nothing extremely expensive, but there was this obsessive nature to it. And she was a collector of things. And we talked about how with collection, it can be a healthy part of who we are, but there can also be this survival strategy in that too, that if I'm a collector, I have to have all of the pieces of the collection. I have to pursue that thing that may be missing, because if I can find that, there will be a complete set. And there was just category after category of these collections that she had. And again, as I was entering into that space, I was so much aware of this external environment was an expression, I would think, of her internal chaos. And I don't know much of her story. I do know some. I know enough to know that there could possibly have, I would say there was trauma. And what can maybe be assumed is that was never processed. And as she aged, that unprocessed trauma just showed up in the spending addiction or in the hoarding. We have a sense that hoarding is about anxiety, and so she was gathering all of these things. One other thing I would say is it was fascinating as we dug through the stuff, we actually came across things that were old and probably very meaningful for her. There was a time when she loved music, and she had, for old people, she had a record collection. She had
Why did he point
Well,
to me?
I thought of music and records, Randy.
Oh, sure.
Music and records.
Oh, speaking of someone who's near the end.
Yeah. Well, she actually had some original, okay, you can't help me on this, the smaller records.
Yeah, the 45s.
45. She had the original 45s of Elvis and those types of things, which at some point probably had monetary value to a record collector. She had a scrapbook where back in the day, you could be a part of the fan club. And so you could be a fan club of this movie star, and they would send you a signed photograph. And she had many of those, she had books of those. And so in all of this chaos were also these things that were incredibly significant and meaningful for
memories.
her. Yeah. And it was really like excavating her life. So I think, again, that's part of the chaos of addiction. There's this beautiful thing that is meaningful and significant hidden within the chaos of the hoarding and the inability to surrender and get rid of things.
And I think as we know here, working with people who are primarily struggling with issues of sexuality, but when you get involved with other addictions, as many of them have multiple addictions, or in the case of Mark's and my recovery, we were able to go to a Recovering Couples Anonymous meeting where everyone brought different addictions there. And it was so helpful because what we realized is underneath the behavior or the choice of drug or the choice of addiction were a lot of the same issues. You know, hidden in there were perhaps things like loneliness. I mean, as you tell me the story, as I heard it before, I was immediately feeling sad for this woman, thinking that perhaps, you know, you described her as a single woman and she was a global traveler, but how lonely that must have been to do a lot of that on her own, and that all these things she collected might have been her friends, so to speak, you know,
Right.
and when she spent time with them, it was like she wasn't alone anymore.
Right.
And what we know about other addictions is they often fill that same need, you know, to not feel alone or not to fit in or whatever it is we're dealing with, those beliefs about ourselves that get painful.
You know, I'm glad that you said that. It reminded me that part of my recovery journey, there was a season where I went to an open 12-step meeting for men and women with any addiction. And it was one of the most powerful experiences. It was later in my recovery. And yet it was so powerful to be there and to be reminded of the similarities between either substance abuse or behavioral addictions and some of the same things that compel us, that drive us, the same chaos that it creates. And so someone talking about one addiction, again, we're back to that principle, instead of trying to compare my addiction, is mine worse, is theirs worse, but to simply be able to say, no, in every story I could identify. And again, you know, as I'm saying about this particular woman, as I stepped into that house, there was so much of this external chaos that I could identify with. There was so much of this that I could relate to. And at one point I turned to Beth and I said, this helps me recommit to my recovery, because I see here what happens, that there is a physical manifestation in this case of those unprocessed traumas or the addiction that can be a substitute for wellness. And there's something about this space that is familiar, and I don't want to come back here.
I've written in my latest book about becoming more so. And I love that term because I believe as I live out my life, as well as watch others who are getting older.
Again,
I just had to bring that up.
thank goodness for Randy being here.
Is that if we don't work on these things, we do become more so, more dependent on behaviors that are not healthy or characteristics about ourselves. If we've been impatient and we're not working on that, by the time we get older, we really have gotten to a place where we're very, very impatient with things and people.
Yeah, let's move on.
Speaking of that, yeah. And so we do have a choice. You know, we have a choice to work on ourselves and what's holding us back from being the best person that we can be. Because when we don't, it really limits our life in terms of our relationships and also the person we can be that people want to be around.
Right.
You know, really, addictions, behaviors, or substances, as we've said before, fall in that category of being in the survivor chair, as we say at the women's workshop, or the survivor himself, as you describe in your workshops. And we know that when we're surviving, we're really taking care of ourselves. It is a very self-centered place. And therefore, as those get stronger and we don't take care of them, it makes sense that our relationships are also being cut off.
Right.
So at the end of our lives, we're basically doing anything and everything we can to just feel better ourselves. And we do let go of and miss the opportunity of some rich relationships.
Right. Well, and anytime we're in the survivor chair and we're involved in addictions or compulsive behaviors, it is a coping strategy and it is a false attempt at self-care. You know, and that's one of the things that we want the men to understand is whatever that may be, when you have that drink, when you spend that money, when you act out sexually, yes, you get temporary relief from the chaos. You get some sort of sense of temporary okayness or euphoria or safety, but it's an illusion and it's not sustainable. And so you get that hit of the drug and then it lasts for a little bit and then you realize, oh my gosh, I'm in pain again, or there's chaos, I can see what's going on. So we reach for it again over and over again. And again, it's that cumulative effect. I often, and in fact, I was talking to the people that I was with and I was asking, you know, when was the last time you were aware, you know, maybe when you were here, and my my sense is that this was a gradual process over time. I do know there was a time when the house was open, that people would visit, that you could walk around, that she could host people. And so over time, it got more and more chaotic. And that's what's true for our own coping strategies and addictions. The illusion is I'm not impacted by this. Others aren't impacted by this. But it's over time you begin to see the cumulative effect of the choices that we make.
And just like any other compulsion, behavior or substance, that it starts getting shameful, and then we start hiding it and lying about it or not inviting people over to really see the true part of our life that we're getting embarrassed by. And so then it perpetuates, as you say. And what I love is that it's no different for any of our behaviors. They're all speaking and crying out for the same solution, something healthier, something that serves us and also will enrich our lives. And so sometimes we just need help figuring out what that is. And I think I just feel a lot of sadness when you share this story. And I think it's because, if any of us had walked in the house maybe when it was halfway starting to accumulate these kinds of things, would we have said anything? Or would it have come out in kidding or shameful kinds of comments? And what we know, I've watched a show on TV about hoarding, and it was so incredibly painful to watch how they dealt with people.
Right.
Total shaming of people who are in this place. And I thought that is definitely not how we help people. And we know that here for sure when we invite people to come and get help. But it's true there, offering them some ideas of getting help or going with them someplace to get some help, or to really talk with them about what a great person they are, and it seems like they're not in a good place here. Something more compassionate so that you could lead to a place where they might take a step towards their well-being.
Yeah, it was interesting. The people I was with, all of them said, I wish that we had known this. I wish that she had been able to invite us over, because we would have much rather have helped her clean her space while she was living versus now after she had died. And what's also true is, I've shared this story with people in my community, and one person shared a similar story, and the story they told was there was someone in their life that was hoarding. They went in, there's all this stuff. And so somebody just went in and cleaned the house and maybe gave them some hints about, don't do this, this is a way to organize your files, and probably meant good, meant to do well, meant to, But what happened was, as soon as that person left, 3 months later, the house was in the very same place, because there was this behavioral solution that tried to address what was apparent, but there was no attempt to understand what was driving the anxiety or the hoarding. And again, I think that that's a great image. If all we do is go in and clean the house for somebody else, but we don't have that conversation about what's really going on for you and what's causing you to keep this stuff, then we may clean the house, but 3 months later it's going to be in the very same place.
So that's just an amen to what we do here.
Yes.
Because, we want to go beyond behavioral solutions. We know that they're only very temporary fixes. And if we don't get to those root causes, which is really what we're all about here, it won't make a difference in the long run. Our more so will come back, and we'll just be as unhappy and as unhealthy as we were.
Right.
And more so eventually.
I've seen that show that you're referencing, because I think it's a fairly popular one on TV. And I think you used the term earlier. As you're watching it, you have this sense of claustrophobia, because there's just an overwhelming amount of stuff everywhere, And it left me with the, how you have observed someone or some behavior and you're finished with it and you go, my life is not that bad. I just, you know what I mean? Just like, let me pick up that sports page. I didn't mean to leave that on the floor. All of a sudden you're a neatnik. But the overwhelming sensation of feeling claustrophobic in that situation is.
Well, and what's also true
thing.
is for people who struggle with addiction, I think they experience their own claustrophobia. They can begin to feel claustrophobic about their own lives because of the way, again, addiction makes those lives smaller, the hiding, the secrets, the loneliness, the isolation, all in an attempt to stay in the addiction gives us this smaller and smaller life. You know, one of the things I would say is a lot of the men who come through our workshop using this imagery have tried to clean the house before or had somebody else try to clean their house. And so somebody came through, or maybe they came through and did the cleaning, but they never took the opportunity to understand what is the clutter about? Why am I doing this? Why do I struggle throwing this stuff away? And I think the power of the workshop, kind of like what you said, the power of our approach here is we're going to help with the cleaning of the house. We're going to give you some practical examples of how you do bring order to the chaos. And we're also going to create a space to talk about what is driving this, understanding, because if I don't understand why I'm doing it, I'm never really going to be successful in my attempts to stop doing it.
Mm-hmm. You know, we talk here too a lot about adrenaline addiction, which is why something becomes more than just a problem or a compulsion, but when it becomes an addiction, we've got a neurochemical aspect to that where we're actually connecting to the adrenaline and the change in our brain chemistry, which gives us that high that something will do for us. And I bet, you know, if there were research being done that hoarding or spending addictions are getting worse and worse, maybe it is somewhat to Amazon and all the online shopping we've all learned to do since COVID. I know even for myself, the adrenaline rush I get from ordering something, and I am a Prime member, and
It's delivered the next day.
I get a present every day if I order something every night. And,
Right.
you know, it's a hit.
And
I tell you.
you're very good with to yourself, you know.
I know.
As,
Well, and I do think, you know, that adrenaline, as I was looking at her collections and the things that she was interested in, I could imagine the excitement that she got when this collectible doll showed up or this specific thing that she was interested in. And even there was some, in her travel, she would buy something, a souvenir, and even in the collections, there were these things that she had gathered from all over the country. She had a book that she had meticulously created with coins from around the world from all of the places that she had traveled. And so there was, ironically, there was this ordered part of her at some point that she lost. You know, there was a part of her that could be organized. She could go on trips. She could organize her collectibles. She could organize the coins from around the world. But when you walked into her house after death, there was nothing that said anything about organization. And I think that that's kind of the way that the addictive energy creeps in. At some point, this thing that we were able to do, we begin to lose the capacity to do that. And then the addiction just begins to fill that space.
And so, you know, it might even be important for any of us who are doing a behavior or using a substance regularly to continue to ask ourselves, what is the need that this is filling for me? Sometimes I wonder when people have a lot of things from traveling, you know, sometimes more than most people might buy. I'm wondering if it speaks to, you know, the value they have in saying, well, I've been here and I've been there and I've been somewhere else, and therefore it makes me an important person that I've been able to do this or something.
Right.
There's probably always something that's behind our behaviors because our behaviors always have meanings to them. They don't just exist by themselves.
Right.
so the items
we can
elevate their self-worth.
They could.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and now I have a fun story. And when I'm with people, I get to share, you know, I can kind of become the life of the party because I have all these things to talk about.
Oh, you're already the life of the
You know
party.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
but
Well,
I mean, it can be a lot of things. We
Right.
talked about loneliness earlier, but just to remember that any addiction is really not about the addiction. It's about what's underneath
Yeah.
it and what purpose is it serving for me? Do
Yeah.
I need to have friends? Do I need to have more social life? Do I need to have more worth and value in my life? Do something?
Well, and it could be, you know, I talk a lot of times with the men that a lot of times they'll use the word boredom for why they do what they do. And that can be the case. What I think many times is more significant, it's a sense of lostness and directionlessness. So they're looking for significance, they're looking for meaning, and in some sort of addictive behavior, spending, traveling, or acting out sexually, there's an attempt to find meaning in their life which they feel like is missing. And very much like what you're saying is, it's important, instead of just being shame, I'm this horrible person because I do these things, kind of the whole principle is we move from shame to curiosity. Why am I doing these things? What's going on for me? And I want to say it again, just very clearly. There is no judgment. There is no shame for this woman. And even as I walked into her house, there wasn't this shame of, oh my gosh, look at her life, or, it was really more of, like you said, sadness and compassion and also identification. And so if there's anyone listening and you are aware that there is this smallness that is coming to your life, and it's coming out of that place of anxiety or fear or loneliness, instead of it being about shame, I'm this horrible person, then let's just ask, what is going on for me and what kind of help do I need? And what's true is, if this woman had had the ability to reach out and ask for help, if she had had the courage to say, hey, something is off, can you come and help me, not just help me clean, but help me understand. If she had reached out to a pastor, a counselor, started getting support, then she might have ended up in a very different place. That is the hope. And so if you are in that place where you are overwhelmed or lost in some sort of behavior or substance or in some sort of coping strategy around your anxiety, know that there's a way forward, that there is a hope, and it begins with the courage to be honest about what is going on. And again, using this image of the house, it was so meaningful for me, that idea of how powerful and how much courage it would have taken for her to invite somebody into her house to see where she is and to also ask for help to be able to get out of that place.
Well, I'm glad that you shared this story with us, because I do believe once it's gotten so far, it's a little bit like being in quicksand, as you say.
Yeah.
And we say, well, why don't they just do this, just make an appointment or something. But I think when we're in quicksand, we really need someone to come along and offer a hand out. And I think that's where so many of us that would like to be helpful, it's because we know that they're incapable of perhaps finally taking that first step for themselves. So remember that if you're walking along somebody with an addiction, that there is that possibility they're in quicksand and they need a helping hand. And I think we can be more empathetic if we will at least explore our own life and what has gotten close to being an addiction, or maybe it's just something different.
Right.
And when we can recognize the smallness, or at least moving towards smallness in our own life, we can have more empathy for someone else who's dealing with something different.
Right. And the challenge is, I often say, if you do something for somebody else that they can do for themselves, you're setting them up to fail. But the other is true too, is if you expect somebody to do something that they cannot do, you're also setting them up to fail. And the wise adult can discern between those two things, to understand this person may not be able to ask for help, and yet if it is offered, they might be able to say yes, especially if they don't sense any judgment or shame. And what's true is that I believe the more we're lost in our addictions and our compulsive behavior, the more we are consumed with shame. And so it's a filter through which we just see every invitation or every ask. It's why we go into isolation. And I do think there's a way of showing up to the best of our ability and it not being about shame, it being about truth and hope, and there being an invitation in that.
And that's also why we would start with our own story. Because that is the best way to invite someone into their own help, is if we share how and when we needed that and what we did for our own fallen place.
Right. And even in this situation, I've never lived, I know, I'm almost done.
I thought I was done with you, and then she jumped in.
I have never lived in a house that was like this. I just never have. And I know what it is to have a small life because of the chaos of addiction. And it is that point of recognition. And that's one of the things in this experience. It was an external manifestation of what was going on internally, and that's what I could identify with.
Well, Greg, as Debbie said, thanks for sharing this story with us today. I think it made for a compelling subject for us to be discussing today. And as always, Debbie, thank you for joining us, and your input and knowledge and experience always is a blessing to us. We'd like to thank you for watching our podcast today. And we hope that you will visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources available to you. There's over 500 podcasts like this one. We invite you to enjoy those. They're a free resource. We also would like you to experience the online information and registration for our 3-day intensive workshops. We do the Men's Journey Workshop every month. We do the Women's Journey Workshop and the Couples Journey Workshops numerous times a year, like almost quarterly. So we invite you to check those out at faithfulandtrue.com. In the meantime, thanks for joining us. We hope that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.